Good afternoon. We're going to start moving people over, so give us just a second. So, Director Hogue, we see you. Give us just a moment. We can see you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
We do a sound check.
Check, check, check. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Eric, do you want to do a sound check?
Good afternoon, Mary Michael.
Good afternoon. Emily. Can we check here? Excellent. Let's see, Director Serrato, can we check your mic? David, we see you. Give us just a second to get your mic on. And Caleb, we see you as well.
Are you able to hear me?
Yes, and we will also get your video enabled. 1 second.
No problem.
Director Kale, we see you. Give us just a moment to get your video up. Director Silvera, do you want to check your mic?
Can you hear me?
Yes, excellent.
Thank you.
Director Serrato, do you want to check your sound?
Sound check, sound check.
We can hear you, thank you. Director Kale, do you want to check your mic?
Yep, okay.
That's very good, thank you, and we can see you. Nav, how about you?
Can you hear me, Mary Michael?
Yes, sir, and we can see you. Melissa, do you want to check your sound?
Sure, good afternoon, I'm here.
Good afternoon. And how about Grant?
Hi, good afternoon, I'm here.
Very good, we can hear you. Paul Stout, can we check your sound?
Yeah, I'm here.
Great, thank you. Stacy, can we check your mic?
Good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon. And I don't think we've checked Caleb. Check your sound.
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Mary Michael, let me know when we're ready.
I see 1, 2, 3. Oh, Director Espinoza's on the line. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 directors. And we know Director Pedroza is going to be a few minutes late, so I'm not sure how many we're expecting. So I defer to you. as to when you want to start.
Well, it is 3:02, so if we want to start on time, I'll go ahead and welcome everyone to the workshop of the Merced County Regional Waste Management Authority. And this is, I think, the fourth one or the third one. I'd like to call the meeting to order at 3:03, according to my Surface Pro. If you would join me for the Pledge of Allegiance, and please stand, we will get started with that. Oh, here we go. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Sorry, I went out of order. Joy, would you like to please take the roll? Maybe other people have joined.
Hi, Madam Chair, this is Stacy. I am going to take the roll today.
Oh, okay.
Let's see, Director Aguilar. Director Kale.
Present.
Director Espinoza.
Present.
Director Faria.
Present.
Director McDaniel. Director Nagy. Director Pereira. Director Pedroso. Director Serrato.
Here.
Director Silvera.
Present.
And Chair Hogue.
Here.
We have a quorum, but we have no action items, so it's unnecessary.
And
Okay.
Madam Chair, Director Pereira has just joined.
Okay, welcome. Okay, so number 2 is a public comment. Public comment is open to anyone to speak on matters not listed on the agenda. Comments are limited to 3 minutes per person. Stacy, you're gonna go over the instructions, please.
As soon as I remembered that I needed to pull them up. So yes, I have so many screens open. Okay, here we go. Let's see. To be recognized to speak, please use the raise your hand feature in Zoom. This can be found on your smartphone, tablet, or computer. If you're calling in from your phone and not using Zoom to view the meeting, please press *9 to alert the moderator of your desire to speak. Individuals who wish to speak will be recognized in the order that they raise their hands and will be taken off mute by staff at the appropriate time. Comments submitted by email or voicemail in advance of the meeting will be read by staff after in-person comments are taken.
Okay, Mary Michael, have you received any public comments by phone or email?
No, I have not.
And do you have anyone who wishes to provide comment to the board today?
I see no raised hands.
Okay. Do we want to wait a second or do we want to move on? Let's move on. So number 3, now that we are going to go back into the workshop portion of the agenda, I will turn it over to Stacy. So Stacy, we have number 3, the landfill gas to energy project workshop. Number 3. Oh, it is number 3.
Yep.
There you go.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and all the directors who are participating today. I'm going to apologize in advance because I know you see me here and I see you here, but I have 2 screens that I'm going to be referencing. So if it looks like you're having to stare at the side of my head, it's my apologies. But it's just going to make everyone's life, I think, a little easier doing it this way. So I'm going to share my screen, hopefully successfully here. I've tried to simplify this as possible. Okay, let me see here. Mary Michael, I have screen sharing capabilities.
You should. Are you getting a message that says you don't have them?
There it is. It'll just say that I'll stop your screen sharing.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, let's see if this now won't let me go into display mode, will it? You would think I would know this after a year of doing this. All right, let's go one more time. Okay, you see my screen, correct?
Shiloh sees it.
Oh, good. Okay, I love that. All right. Okay. Are you seeing this, Mary Michael?
Yes.
Okay.
You're just not in presentation mode.
Yeah, we're just going to go with
Okay.
it because I am just going to continue to screw this up and try to multitask. Okay, so here we go. Without further ado. All right, so thank you guys again. I wanted just to do a quick check-in on where we ended the last workshop and then where we're going to go with the one we're talking about today, because it really is our goal to wrap things up today if we can, answer questions and have lots of time for discussion so that we don't have to have another workshop, because this is our third one. So with that, I am going to just do a real quick overview of the project or the workshop topics for today. So the goal of today is to review the economic analysis of the landfill gas to energy project. And we're going to hear from KNN, our financial advisors. Before we do that, I do want to provide an update to the project costs that we have incorporated into the pro forma since our last workshop. So at that workshop, and then in subsequent conversations that we had with several of the directors, we heard concerns about making sure that we were capturing the universe of costs when we were analyzing the project economics. I refer to it now as the kitchen sink approach, like really get down and like, what is the lifetime of this project going to cost us, and all of these kind of, you know, related but not directly related costs that we might incur. So we've been digging into that. We created a kitchen sink scenario. It incorporated a few increases to some operations and maintenance costs that already were factored in. It added a couple of new capital costs that hadn't been factored in. And then it also looked at the impact to the RWA operations in terms of staff time and consultant services and the like. So I'm going to review those numbers and those changes, and specifically drill those down so you can see where those, how those change and how they affect kind of the net revenue by the time we get to what KNN is going to talk about. And then I'm going to hand it over to Eric, and he's going to talk about the summary pro forma before we get to KNN. So the project, the cost updates. This slide is a comparison of the project costs that we presented in the second workshop in the blue box. The green table is the updated costs that we've incorporated into the analysis. So you'll see that the gross revenue has not changed. It is maintained at 62.6 million. But the kitchen sink scenario in green incorporates those changes that I just referenced. So I've indicated them with these orange arrows here that you see, the 3 arrows. So there's an additional 1.9 million that was added for the optional 5th turbine, and then also the decommissioning of the site. That's essentially when at the end of the 20-year term, it's mutually agreed upon that the project won't continue. We would have to return the site at UC Merced to its original state. So we factored those costs in. Then for the operations and maintenance costs, these were captured over here at 13.9. So there was a $2.6 million increase here that I'll speak to on the next slide, as well as this $10 million here, which is about $500,000 a year that we factored in for potential cost impacts to RWA, and I break those down too in the next slide. So what that does is you can see how it affects the net revenue before bonds, proceeds, and debt service costs. It goes from 24.3 to 9.9 million dollars. But let's pin that for a second, and I'm going to walk through really quickly, or I guess at this pace you would like, if you have questions, what those 3 arrowed numbers I just summarized. Each of those are represented here in a column. So these 3 arrowed areas, O&M services cost increases. These were services that were in the original analysis that we talked about, but we have dug in a little deeper. We talked to the folks at Burbank who are operating, or Eric did, operating a similar project. And we really, tried to take that kitchen sink approach and say, okay, how should we be adjusting these in a worst case scenario? And you can see here how these amounts changed. Again, kind of referencing what we originally were planning, but if we're going to take a kitchen sink scenario, we update them and you see that $2.6 million increase. For the big number here is this O&M cost for RWA. And these are costs that we anticipate the RWA could potentially incur over the lifetime of the project. And I'll also say though, while I say they could be, some of these we will incur likely whether we do the project or not, because we already have a gas collection system. We already have the services around, the shutdown call. So some of this stuff would already be happening whether we move forward or not with the project, but it does kind of expand on that. And it also adds an extra, that RWA labor is an extra staff person. So we really were inclusive when we captured this universe of costs in the worst case scenario. And that's what you see at that additional cost of $500,000 a year, which would add $10 million to the cost of the project. And then finally, and I think simply, are just these two additional capital costs that are pretty straightforward. That fifth turbine cost, and then the decommissioning of the UC site at the end of the 20 years, which represented the 1.9. So that's the breakdown. If you add these three areas of cost changes to the last analysis we discussed, it shows that project cost increase for the kitchen sink scenario to go up by $14.5 million, which is what brings us to this grand total of 52.7. So I know I threw a lot at you, but I promise all that I was wanting to do here was to get straight the costs that we've built in now into the analysis, why they happened, that it really is worst case scenario, kitchen sink approach that takes into account all of these other, potential events that may or may not occur and that might associate with additional costs to the project. The last thing I want to mention before, and I'm happy to ask questions or redirect questions to other more capable members of this, the team here. The one thing I did want to mention is that this doesn't take into account the cost savings that we would realize if we did this project by not having to do the flare upgrade, which would represent about a $2.5 million cost savings. So that's something that we would add into this mix if the project were to move forward. And next is Eric on the pro forma, which is tied, but if there's questions here, I see Scott's hand up, our Director Silvera's hand up. I'm happy to field questions.
Director Silvera.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, no, Stacy, in your comments, you had mentioned that after speaking with some directors, you kind of changed the approach, and I'll go on the record as saying I was one of those directors that spoke to you. It just felt like for me, in order to wrap my head around what does this deal exactly look like, I wanted to know worst case scenario, and the thought process behind that is that ultimately, if the RWA agrees to something, for me, I'm looking at what risk am I putting on our constituents? Because if something doesn't add up, ultimately it's going to go back to the taxpayers, the RWA, through rate increases that would have to pay for any I'm going to call it miscalculations on our part now. So I really want to thank you for really getting us to numbers. And I understand these are the worst case scenario numbers. These are putting in there, additional costs that may never materialize. But I think for us, in order for this group to make a solid decision moving forward, we need to have every bit of information out there that gives us the best chance to make a good decision. So I just wanted to thank you for that, and thank you for explaining that.
You're welcome. Okay, Mary Michael, do you see any other hands? Otherwise, I'll turn it over to Eric and I'll just pull up the pro forma slide for him.
I don't see anything else right now.
Okay, Eric gets the fun job here.
Thank you, Stacy. Good afternoon, everybody. So yes, you do have a pro forma summary that is in front of you that does take into account this throwing in the kitchen sink approach. I'll tell you, we spent a lot of time putting this together. And so with that, this is a summary. I know the pro forma was included in your agenda packet, but this summarizes what the executive director has just shared with you. And so the highlighted orange columns are going to be that throwing in the kitchen sink approach of O&M, and it's going to include that $500,000 of RWA annually, annual increase in O&M charges. Depreciation, so the yellow columns that you see, this is the top bar graph goes from the years 2021 through 2031. So that's a 10-year snapshot. And then you have the second 10 years on the bottom. So both that orange on the annual O&M cost will be both for the first 10 years on the top and then for the latter 10 years on the bottom. You'll notice the depreciation line, and the line for depreciation is something that's spanned over a 15-year period. And of course, depreciation is an accounting tool that allows us to allocate costs of this equipment over the lifespan of its useful lifespan. And so it depreciates the value of this equipment over that span of time. And so that is the amount that you see for the 15-year depreciation. The third column, or third row rather, is the capital investment. And so this capital investment in 2021, summarized in the $24,269,950, would be for the first part and first leg of the project, which in your pro forma, that was to put in number 1, 2, and 3 microturbines at UC Merced, with a 4th microturbine at the landfill for electricity. So that would be what you would get in the first year for that $24.2 million. That capital cost has not changed, as the executive director has told you from before till now, with the exception of the year 2027. In 2027, that would be in that line item capital investment. That then brings us to the 5th microturbine that could then be installed. This would not be a part of the capital bond payment. This would rather be something that comes out of the authority's revenues. And it would be up to us to put that in. And then if you go down on the green column there, still keeping with the top bar graph, you have total revenue. So this is your electricity sales. So these are the revenues generated by the sales to the UC campus for the electricity sold there. So in the first year, what we expect is that the capital items will be purchased, and then going into 12 months to 16 months, as MCAG has said that they can get this project done very quickly. We would expect the system to come online in year 2, but maybe not be fully making, maybe it's half the year of year 2, if you will. And so that's why you see a revenue that's based on electricity sales being paid for at a lesser than full breadth of electricity pullout. And so as we get into year 2023, you begin to see the full electricity of the 2.5 in revenue that continues from those electricity sales. If we move on to the years of 2032 through 2041, if you will move over to the year 2041, I would just highlight the $150,000 as the executive director has highlighted in her presentation, that this is for the decommissioning of the turbines at the UC campus should we come to that point. I will tell you this number is estimated to be low in part because of the sheer value of the equipment and its scrap metal, which we would anticipate would offset some of those demolition costs. And so below what you have then on both of these summaries, below the total revenue green rows rather, you then have a net revenue of what we would expect, and this is the total kitchen sink approach, where this is worst case scenario, of what we could then expect our net revenues to be. Now, this is net revenues before we get into our debt service, such as our bond payments. And that leads us now into the K&N presentation. Happy to answer any questions.
Are there any hands? I don't see any hands raised.
Director Pereira.
Oh.
Thank you. Eric, a couple questions. One is, do these costs include the tie-in to PG&E at both UC and the landfill?
Yes.
And then has PG&E agreed to the NEM interconnection?
Yes, they are. Yes, we have filed already the interconnection agreements with PG&E and they have agreed to those. Yes.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Sure.
Are there any other questions?
I see no hands raised.
If that's the case, Madam Chair, we'd like to turn it over to the team at K&N. I believe we have David, Melissa, and Grant on the call, and I will stop screen sharing so that they can bring up their presentation.
Okay.
Yeah. And I feel like, you know, to the earlier comment from the last workshop where we feel like it's a cliffhanger, like here we are. There's no more cliffhanging. No pressure, David and Melissa and Grant.
Are you able to hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. Excellent.
Can you be a little louder, David? Sorry.
I can certainly try. Let me go into my audio settings. My microphone
You're just a little echoey, but I can hear you.
My microphone seems to be turned up all the way, but I can speak louder.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so why is this coming up when I screen share? Hold on. Grant, why don't I let you do the screen sharing?
Sure, give me 1 second.
I don't have to. I don't even, this wasn't even on my screen. I'm not sure why the agenda is still showing. Okay.
Is that showing up okay?
Yeah, it is. You can just turn to the first page. Excellent. Okay. Thank you, Stacy, for the introduction. Madam Chair, members of the board. My name is David Leifer. I work with K&N Public Finance. As mentioned, I'm joined by my colleagues, Melissa Schick and Grant Carson. We are municipal advisor to the authority. We've worked with MCAG for many years in lots of different capacities, both on solid waste and on the transportation sales tax program. And in our role as municipal advisor, our primary job or purpose is to give you independent, objective analysis and advice to support good decision-making by you particularly about the debt program. We are a regulated entity, so we have a fiduciary duty assigned to us by the SEC, which is the highest sort of standard of care. By law, we must put our clients' interests ahead of our own. We would do that anyway, but just gives you a sense of the role. We sort of sit on your side of the table to help you make good policy decisions, ideally. And then ultimately, we are involved in the bond transaction. We will protect our clients' interests throughout that process in any number of ways. And then we also get involved, as we have here for more than a year, on the development of a plan of finance and looking at sort of cash flow modeling, evaluating debt capacity to give you a sense of the range of roles that we would play in a program. With that, let's go to the next page. So for today, as already said, we have two goals for today. One, we want to talk about the economics of the landfill gas energy project. And now finally, layer in the cost of debt. So you get the complete picture. And as Stacy said, put an end to the cliffhanger. You know, does the project revenues, do they support bonded debt service on their own? Will the project actually add surplus revenues to the enterprise, or will it draw down revenues from the enterprise after the repayment of the debt? So we're going to look at the project first. That's the first part of my presentation. And then the second part of the presentation is to look more widely at the overall solid waste enterprise, because in this case, the bonds are going to be secured by the revenues of the entire enterprise. And we'll talk about why, but that's going to help you get the highest rating and the lowest cost of funds. So we want to make sure and look at the impact that this project might have on the overall enterprise, which fundamentally is very healthy. And you have high cash reserves in the enterprise, very good debt service coverage, very strong enterprise. We want to make sure that that will continue to be the case even after issuing this debt. And we're going to answer the question, how much debt capacity the enterprise has, even after issuing this debt for the project, after the existing debt that you already have outstanding. How much additional debt could you reasonably expect to issue in the future for other projects if they were other projects, that needed debt financing for the enterprise? So we're going to answer that question as well. So it's a two-piece look. The first is the project alone on a standalone basis. And then the second is to look at your enterprise and talk a little bit about how the bonds will work. Okay. Next slide. Okay, so we're going to start just with the project and look at the cash flow for the project now with the debt, adding that into that pro forma that Eric and Stacy have talked about already. So we start just as to orient ourselves with really the revenues, the project net revenues before bonds and debt service. And we've taken a slightly different approach. This is information that was taken from the pro forma and from Tetra Tech's forecast. And what we've done is we've got two lines here, the two green lines. And one is showing that this is the net revenues before the debt. And we're going to layer on the debt in a minute with the kitchen sink, if you will. And that's the dotted line. So the net revenues are lower because you have all those additional costs allocated to the project. And then we're going to look at it with the other bookend as if you didn't allocate any of those additional RWA costs. And that's the solid green line up above. You obviously have more net revenue when you have less cost allocated to the project. And so that'll be a policy decision. If you want to assume that all of that additional 10 million of cost is allocated to the project, then we're looking at the dotted line. And for a point of reference, we're going to look at it as if none of it was allocated, and we'll look at the solid green line. And now we're going to look at it with debt. So let's go to the next page. But that page 4 is really information that has been provided to us. K&N hasn't been involved in developing that information. It's technical information about how much revenue the project will generate and what the O&M expenses will be each year. So now comes our role. And we are tasked with advising you on the issuance of the bonds to pay for the project. And this is a preliminary debt sizing. And we are solving to generate $24,269,950, as Eric laid out. And that number really comes from the analysis that MOSTEC has done. It's a preliminary number, of course, but that's the working assumption for the cost of the project. And then we also have to borrow sufficient to do some other things necessary to issue the bond. We need to fund what's called a debt service reserve fund, which is a credit feature there to protect investors in the event you are unable to make your debt service. Assuming you will make your debt service, it comes back at the end and helps retire the bonds 1 year early. We also need to fund what's called capitalized interest. Capitalized interest will pay the interest on the bonds in that very first year or two when the project isn't yet generating revenues. So you don't have project revenues, so we're going to borrow some interest to pay the interest to the bondholders while we wait for the project construction to be complete and come online. And then delivery expenses are the expenses estimates associated with actually delivering the bonds. Just a little bit about our assumptions. We have a page in the appendix which goes into much more detail, but the security for the bond, as I mentioned, is structured around the net revenues of the enterprise. So the enterprise brings in revenues from tip fees, and including revenues from this project, but other revenues as well. We net out the O&M, and we have net revenues available to pay debt service. We are assuming, I think conservatively, that this would achieve an A rating or in the A category from Standard & Poor's based on our experience with solid waste revenue bonds. We certainly will be aiming for a higher rating than that. We'll be chasing the AA, but I think for purposes of the pro forma, we want to use a lower rating, assuming a higher cost of funds to be more conservative. The tax status of these bonds would be tax exempt, which is a positive. That means we can borrow at lower rates. The term of the bond would be 20 years to match the term of the project with a final maturity at the end of 41. And we have assumed here, based on the current, sort of projection of where interest rates are, that the overall cost of funds is about a 2.64%. And that has a little bit of cushion in it. That's today's market plus another 50 basis points of potential increase before we actually get to issue these bonds. Obviously, we don't know where rates will be at the time of issuance, but we think that's a reasonable working assumption. Obviously, if we can get a higher rating, we would be able to get lower interest rates and bring down that cost of funds. And then the overall, net debt service is totaled up here, although I think it'll be more illustrative to see it in a couple of following slides. And of course, you can stop me with questions as we go, or we can wait to the end of this section. There's only another 4 or 5 slides. Okay, Grant. Okay, here we go. Now we're getting to the good stuff. We can answer those questions, the cliffhanger that Stacy was talking about. So this is our first of 2 scenarios. This is the first of the 2 bookends. And this bookend is the kitchen sink bookend, as has been colloquially referred in this workshop so far. So we're including those full costs, including the $10 million of what we're calling RWA costs, some of the labor for the call outs and things like that. And we're going to present this scenario with 2 slides. The first is looking at the economics and the coverage for the debt service, which I'll explain in a minute. The second is going to look at it from a cash perspective. We start with $0. What do we end with at the end of the day? Do we have surplus revenues or do we actually have negative revenues at the end of the day? We're going to answer that question in a second. So what we have here on the left are figures that have been provided to us. Again, this is from the pro forma, from the Tetra Tech analysis. We've got your total revenues. You can see in column A adding up to that 62 million that was on the earlier tables. And now we have the O&M, which totaled 16.5 million. And then we have these incremental new costs that we've allocated in this example of an additional 10 million. And so what we're calling net revenues at this point are in column D, the 36 million that was at the end of the pro forma. Okay, but we haven't actually paid for the project yet or paid back any debt. So that's what happens over in columns E through G. We've issued, that 24 million or 27 million really that we talked about earlier. This is a preliminary amortization of the principal and the interest. And then we have our annual net debt service. And the reason that we're showing zeros in the first 2 years is that we have borrowed that capitalized interest. So effectively, the first 2 years, the interest is being paid by money that we borrow. It's not being paid from the revenues generated in the project. And same in the last year. You can look down at 2041. We're not seeing any net debt service. And the reason there is, remember that debt service reserve fund that we're borrowing. It's about 1 year's of debt service, like $1.8 million. And that will come in at the end and help pay off the bond a year early without needing to draw on the revenues generated by the project. So column G is your net debt service. And so column H is really the surplus or the deficit annually that the project will generate relative to debt service, taking into account the debt service under this scenario, which is the full kitchen sink scenario. And so what you can see is in some of the earlier years, you run a slight negative, and then it, in particular, after that last turbine is installed in 27, it starts to turn positive. But really, you know, they're sort of break-even numbers is how I would characterize this. And what this is telling us, you know, from a coverage ratio perspective, and that's just the terminology that we use in the bond world, is that when you're generating enough revenues to cover your debt service, you got 1 times coverage. And when you have a surplus, you're above 1 times coverage. And that's what these ratios are showing us. The, you know, in 2030, we're generating close to $300,000. And that's 1.16 times our annual debt service obligation of $1.8 million in that year. But let's go to the next slide and look at this from a cash perspective. So in this case, what we're saying is we start the project with $0. And again, we're setting aside all the money you got in the enterprise. You got, you know, $30, $40 million of cash in the enterprise, but we're trying to look at this just on a standalone basis. So we start with 0. And of course, in that first year, you're not generating any revenue because you don't have the project built yet. We are bringing in the 24 million of bond proceeds. So that's an asset. Then we're spending the 24 million, effectively in 1 year. I don't know, maybe the construction will go a little longer, but that's, I think, a good working assumption. And then we have no net debt service that year because we have the capitalized interest. And same in year 2, we have a little bit of net revenue, but really no debt service. So you're positive 250, you know, 253,000. And then that's column F. And then in column G, it's the cumulative look. And so what you're seeing is each year, 24, 25, 26, we're running, you know, slight deficits between basically the net debt service and the net revenue, you know, columns E and B, if you will. And then in 27, we got this 1.7 million that we need to pay to use to pay for the last turbine. We've assumed that that's paid with cash from the project. Now you could go and bond for that too and spread out the cost, but I think this is a more conservative way to look at it. And it's such a small number, we wouldn't want to do a whole bond probably. You know, we would look at other ways if it was necessary to finance it. So that's why you're running a big deficit in 27 in column F. 2027 column F, you're running negative 1.7 million. But you know, these numbers aren't really huge given if you think about your enterprise with tens of millions of dollars of cash coming and going. And then in 28, it starts to turn positive on an annual basis, but you're still chipping away at your cumulative deficit that you kind of built up to a high point in 2027 of 2.5 million. Now you're chipping away at that, you're chipping away each year because you have a little bit of surplus going. And finally, in 2041, based on this scenario with these cost assumptions and this debt service assumption, you turn positive to the tune of about $834,000. Obviously, if we get a stronger rating or interest rates don't move another 50 basis points or whatnot, we'll be able to bring the net debt service numbers in E down a little bit, and that'll help. You know, this gives you a sense that the project is able to stand on its own 2 feet in a sense at the end of the day, but assuming you allocate all of the RWA costs, the new 10 million, you're kind of at a break-even scenario, I call this. I mean, it's a net positive at the end of the day, but you run some, you know, slight deficits along the way. So that's the answer with the kitchen sink in. Let's turn now to scenario 2. Okay, so here we've excluded the RWA costs. And again, for a long time, I think the pro forma never had these costs in it. And it was only recently at the direction of the board and Stacy and Nav and Eric and others that we said, okay, well, let's look at it with absolutely everything that could be allocated. And so now we're going back to this scenario where we don't allocate those 10 million to the project, either because some of those are already going to be authority expenses or because they might not happen. You know, it's the bookend. And here, it's a much more positive scenario, not surprisingly. you have the same, you have higher net revenue numbers because we have lower O&M. We have still the column B, but we don't have that incremental column C, incremental RWA costs. So we have higher net revenues. We have the same debt service. So now when you compare, C minus F, you're suddenly positive in every year. And then, and it's stronger coverage. And then if you go to the next slide, looking at it from a cash perspective, Grant, let's go one more. Thank you. So now you see you're building some real sizable cash surplus. And that surplus is column F. You're building surplus right away. You chip away at the surplus when you got to spend $1.7 million on the turbine. But then you start building it again, and you end at the end of the day with over $10.8 million. So really two different bookends. One scenario, very positive at $10.8 million. Another scenario, positive still at 800,000, but kind of more break even and a little bit negative along the way. And, the way I think about this is it's not so much we don't know what the revenue is going to be. I mean, I think Tetra Tech and management feel they do through the PPA with UC and with the expected, gas generated at the site. It's more a question of how you allocate these expenses, and whether the expenses come to fruition. If you decide to allocate them all to the project, then you're looking at the 800,000, and if they come to fruition. And if you say, some of those really are authority expenses anyway, so let's not allocate them to this project, then you've got a bit more surplus that is being generated by the project. And I don't know that there's a right or wrong way to look at it, frankly. I think it's smart to be conservative and definitely look at it with all the costs included and decide that if you allocate it that way and if all these costs do materialize, are we still comfortable with this project generating a surplus, but at the end of the day of 800,000. So it could be very fruitful for the enterprise if the excluding scenario 2 is the way to look at it, or it still will be with these numbers positive if under scenario 1, but not till sort of the end of the day. And if you go to the next slide, Grant, I think this just summarizes what I just said. But scenario 1, the net revenues generated by the project are basically equivalent to the overall costs, including the debt service. The cumulative cash balances run negative until the final year of the project, again, giving these set of assumptions. And we end the cash, just under $1 million at the end of the term after all the debt has been paid. Whereas in scenario 2, when we don't allocate the RWA costs and this kitchen sink look, the net revenues clearly exceed the project costs and generate a healthy surplus. Cumulative cash balances are positive in almost every year, except when you have that big capital expenditure in 27, and you end close to 11 million to the positive at the end of the day. What you do with that positive is another discussion with management. It would presumably go into the enterprise and be available either to pay other debt of the enterprise or to fund other projects, other capital needs of the enterprise. And then one last slide in this section, and then I'll stop. And that is just a peek at the moment of where interest rates are. And you can see, and I think we all know, it's a very favorable time if you decide to move forward with this project. It is a very favorable time to be issuing bonds, tax-exempt bonds, probably more favorable than when you started looking at this project, however many years ago that was. You can see over on the right, the yellow line is a 20-year tax-exempt bond, 20-year maturity, and the blue is a 10-year maturity. So you would expect to pay a higher rate for a longer maturity bond, just like a home mortgage. You'll pay a higher rate for a longer mortgage. But they sort of mirror each other. And you can see we're all the way over in 2021. Rates have been super low for a long period of time while the economy has been underperforming due to COVID largely. And you can see that our current rates up in that box for the 10-year and the 20-year, sort of, this assumes a AAA rated bond, are well below the averages since 2010, about half or close to that at least of the average since 2010. Now we have had a little uptick that you can see over at the very right. You can put your cursor over that, Grant, if you want. Just in the last couple of weeks thank you. We're seeing, a slight uptick in rates, both with treasury rates and municipal rates have followed, due in part to some, concerns about inflation and all the stimulus that's being introduced into the economy, eventually causing, an overheating or at least a heating up of the market and a potential for inflation. But it has since stabilized. So we had kind of this run up of about 50 basis points from really a historical low, and they're still quite low. As I said, in our pro forma, we've assumed another 50 basis point run up between now and the time that the bond actually is issued. So hopefully that doesn't occur, and hopefully we would be able to enter the market at lower rates than we've shown you. But overall, if you're going to do this project and you're going to need to issue the debt, this is a great time to do it, is the takeaway. And I guess with that, Grant, maybe you can zoom back in, and I will stop, Stacy and Eric. And we'll move one more slide, if you would, Grant, just to show that the next section is a little bit more about how a solid waste enterprise revenue bond works, what the pledge is, and then look at your enterprise in particular and the revenues and expenses that it's generating and how this debt will affect that. But obviously, if the debt is at a minimum break even, it shouldn't have a big negative effect on the enterprise over the life. And if the debt, if it turns out that the project is generating surplus, like in scenario 2, then it's going to have a positive impact on the enterprise. But we will, in this section 2, answer the question about how much additional debt capacity we think the enterprise reasonably has for future projects. And I can tell you now, it's in the, I don't remember, it's $35 to $45 million, I think, of additional debt capacity based on the strength of your enterprise. And that's without tip fee increases or without increasing costs. And some of that is due to the out-of-county waste that you guys have benefited from. And so we, at the very end of our presentation, run a couple of stress scenarios and show what happens to the enterprise, if you lose half of the out-of-county waste on the one hand, or if you were to lose all of the out-of-county waste on the other hand. And the answer is that if you lose half of it, you're okay with your bonds, I think, with both sets of bonds. But if you were to lose it all and not take corrective action, not increase tip fees, not reduce costs, not replace that revenue somehow, then you would not be in a position to pay all your debt service. And that's the case whether you issue this new debt or not. I mean, that's a problem you would have regardless, though perhaps it might be made a little bit worse with the new debt. But you presumably at that point would take corrective action and have to raise rates. So I'm going to stop, and maybe, Grant, if you could go back to scenario 1, put the page up there. Let's go to the cash one. That's good. And let's see if there's any questions at this point. Otherwise, we'll move into the second part of our presentation.
Director Faria.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So the range, we're looking at a $10 million differential and range of what the resulting revenue could be at the end of the 20 years. Am I reading that correctly?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much.
Are there any other questions? Director Perea.
All right, thank you, Madam Chair. So I guess, as I look at the $834,627 number, and I divide that out by 20 years, I don't know anybody who would be willing to risk risk that many millions of dollars for that kind of return. So am I missing something? And then my second question is there a reason why you didn't address just a straight loan versus bonding this project? Is it not borrowable?
Okay, let's answer the latter question first. When you talk about a loan, you still, I think a loan, whether it's a loan or a bond, it's still structured with a pledge of the net revenues of the enterprise in order to get an investor to the table and to get a rate that would even be reasonably attractive. So then it's really a question of, do you go out with what we call a direct purchase and work with a single bank versus structuring and issuing a bond? And yeah, we have looked at that, and we think it's probably more economic to do the bond. Generally, what happens is when you go out to a bank, you might have lower costs of issuance. You don't need to do it perhaps and get a rating and do a full disclosure document, but you would have higher interest rates. It's a less liquid investment. If you can even find a bank willing to lend in the solid waste space, it would be a lot easier. For example, when we do a county deal for you for an administration building, I think that's viewed differently and more positively, a county general fund credit versus a solid waste enterprise credit. So we would, maybe have lower cost of issuance, but higher interest rates. And so at some point, if this was only a $5 million deal, I'd say, yeah, the bank loan is probably the way to go. And then the other issue is, will banks go out a full 20 years on this? The sweet spot for banks tend to be, 10 to 12, maybe 15 years. Might be a stretch to get them to go out 20. So anyway, those are my comments on that. And then Melissa, if you have anything you want to add on that, any thoughts?
Nothing to add.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. Those are the two ways to do a financing. I just think that, if this was smaller and shorter and, a county-backed credit, it would lend itself a bit better to the, to the direct loan approach. Back to your first question, I don't know if that was a rhetorical question or not. Are we missing anything? I don't think you're missing anything in this scenario. I guess it depends. If you believe that you're allocating all of the RWA expenses to the project rather than to the enterprise, then yeah, you look at your 800,000, you divide it by 20. That's not it's not a huge return. I guess. It depends on what your motivation is for doing the project also. Is it to do the project and make sure you're at least break even, or is it to generate a certain target surplus revenue? And that's a policy decision more than a financial one, I think.
And so I guess then my third question would probably be to Eric. What are the net savings to RWA if we did this project? You have those totaled?
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate that. The net savings one, if we don't do this project, as the executive director had said, we're looking at having to make a low NOx flare improvement to the Highway 59 flare. So that's in our timeline right now. That's about $2.5 million. So if we don't do this project, we have to do that. A net savings would say that we would save the 2.5 million, and then you could apply that then to this capital investment. I really think that the project, again, we from the last workshop really heard that we needed to put everything into this project that potentially could go awry. And as we look at the O&M costs, as the executive director said, we have a contract right now for a gas collection and control system operations. We've got a fiber optic line to our gas collection system. When there's a problem, that line directly contacts our vendor. Our vendor's been approved by this, or by the governing board. And so we have budget authority for anything that should occur in that. And I will tell you that in the last year, we've got a 1-year agreement with that vendor. We had the ability to extend it a 2nd year. We have done that. And in that 2-year period, we have not spent, more than 80% of the fund of that pot we have not spent into. And it's really predicated on if there's an event. The system requirements on this landfill gas to energy state that it's got to be up 95% of the time, which means that if there's an event that occurs, that same fiber optic line would still ring to our vendor, and our vendor would still come out for that callback service. But if that callback service requires continuing work, and let's say it's work that's off of the RWA site, it's going to be now on the UC Merced campus site where the turbines are located in that first year. There could be additional calls for service that occurs, and that's where this kitchen sink model came into play. And so, Director, to answer your question for net savings, I would say right on the forefront, it's the 2.5 million, and then any savings would be realized, and this $10 million could be realized if we don't have extenuating circumstances with the use of the system. Now, the system does have warranties with each of the turbines, which we've included the cost for purchasing those warranties, and those can be 5, 10, 15, and 20-year warranties. So, that can help with this. But again, I hope that answers a little bit of the question.
Yeah, no, that was a great answer. That's what I was looking for. And then my last question is, who would the turbines be purchased from?
Right, so we are purchasing Capstone generation equipment, and my predecessor had them. Maybe if I can lean on the folks from Tetra Tech. Paul, are you on the call? Maybe you can speak to the type of equipment we're purchasing or looking to purchase.
No, no. That was explained to us that it's cutting edge technology at one of the previous workshops. I just don't remember who we're buying them from, and then actually who is buying them. That's the question.
Well, yeah, I think the answer is that MCAG is going to buy them. That is the construction partner that's been selected, and they're coming from Cal Microturbine.
And does Tetra Tech or MCAG have a financial interest in that company?
I don't. We don't. Tetra Tech doesn't. I don't believe MCAG does either. Peter Brinzy, can you comment on that?
I don't see him on the screen as able to talk, but I'm pretty sure they don't either, but he could probably.
Yeah, I'm.
Okay. Yep. Thank you for that. I'm done.
This is Peter Brinzy speaking from MCAG Power. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, great. Thank you. MCAG has no financial interest in Capstone or Cal Microturbines. MCAG will, however, be purchasing the turbines on behalf of the RWA, and we will, in doing so, fully wrap the performance, the output, the heat rate, and the emissions, all of which would be guaranteed and financially backed by MCAG. That's a method to fully de-risk those elements of the project to the RWA.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we have Scott. Oh, Director Silvera, sorry.
April, you can call me whatever you want. Just don't call me late to dinner, okay? David, question for you.
Yes.
Are you? Yes. I mean, this is what you guys do. This is what you do for a living, is you look at these scenarios. What's your thoughts on them? You're the third-party independent reviewer of this, that you're looking strictly, you have no interest in it other than just looking at the numbers.
Yeah.
What's your gut tell you on this?
Well, you're asking me, like, what would I do if I was sitting in your chair, or, I guess.
Yeah, both. Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, again, I think it really gets to the motivation for doing the project. Like, often we'll have a solid waste system, or usually it's a county, right? They run their solid waste system, and they're going to do a project, and they want to do the project and make sure it at least breaks even and isn't draining their enterprise, right? That's often the lens that is sort of brought to us. It's like, look, we have this project, we feel it serves lots of purposes. Maybe it's environmental, maybe it's other, maybe avoidance of cost that we would have to address other ways, or it's regulatory. Let's just make sure this thing isn't going to, you know, we're going to take a bath on it. So with that lens, you know, if these expenses really are the kitchen sink, and I trust that a lot of smart people have looked at that, then I'd say, yeah, this isn't bad, because even though you're running negative in certain years, you know, those aren't huge numbers of negative either. But clearly it's not a huge win either at the end of the day at 800,000. So, but if the sole purpose is to, you know, prime the pump and make a bunch, you know, make a lot of money, this may not be the vehicle. But I mean, it's very rare for me, in my experience, and Melissa can speak to it also, to hear a public agency look at a project strictly from a moneymaker perspective. That's just not the typical lens. Usually there's other things going on, regulatory, addressing a need, expansion, growth, whatever, you know, or environmental, got to deal with the gas. And that's the more typical lens. So it's not like you have $24 million sitting in the bank and you got to decide you want to do investment A or investment B, right? That's not really the situation. You're not saying, hey, should I invest in Bitcoin or in the Dow Jones? Or you don't have that 24 million, you're borrowing it to begin with. So it's really not a sort of private sector analysis in my view. It's more about, from a public policy point of view, does this project serve multiple needs that are important? And are you, you know, comfortable that you can afford it? I think the conclusion is comfortably you can afford it. But that doesn't answer the question of can I make a lot of money from it? So I don't mean to dodge the question. It's just that it depends on your lens, I think.
No, and I appreciate your honesty in the answer. It's like for me, because I'm one of the ones again that asked for, you know, I don't want to make pennies, I want to make dollars, and maybe one could draw the conclusion on your comment of, you know, typically government agencies aren't looking to make money on something. Well, I could maybe make an argument that maybe they should. And because ultimately the way that I look at this is that it goes, you know, ultimately, I prefaced it in my comments earlier that the taxpayers are on the hook for this. Yeah. And when I mean the taxpayers is the folks that use the RWA, that their waste goes there. If as a board, we make a bad decision, those folks are going to have to pay the consequences and most likely in the form of higher rates. And just think about this crazy concept for a second, that we actually make a good investment and we're able to watch out for it. We could maybe lower rates. How about that? Wouldn't that be the craziest thing you ever heard? But so that's kind of the lens that I'm looking at it through. But again, what it goes back to me is the fact that, you know, when you start talking about the 2.5 million that we know we're not going to have to spend in upgrading our flare system, a penny saved is a penny earned, right? So when you add that into it, yeah, that $835,000 number is not something that I'm ready to, you know, go running home and telling mom we did real great today about. But I think with the approach that staff has taken and the whole throw the kitchen sink at it, I want to know all the risks. I think we're probably going to end up somewhere in the middle. I think, you know, and listen, this is pure speculation. This is not my line of work. I don't know anything more about landfill to gas than what I've been taught over this deal. But if you end up somewhere in the halfway range, and we're at 5 million to the good on the deal at the end of this, and then you figure in we saved the 2.5 million. Now you're at 7.5 million. I don't think it's a bad deal. I think I'm more convinced now after seeing the numbers. And then I guess those are more just like kind of my comments and my thoughts at this point. But when we talk about the bond rating, on the scenario you showed us, that was at A-rated bonds.
Yes.
And obviously you're estimating on the conservative side, pushing a little bit more there on the interest in case rates go up.
Yes.
Where do you think we end up? Because I mean, the difference between A and AAA is pretty big. Do we end up somewhere in the middle on that, do you think?
That's a really good question. I mean, and Melissa can help me here. We did a financing for Santa Barbara County. We did one for Yolo County, all solid waste financings. And Melissa, were we able to get up to the AA minus? Was that where we got on a couple of those?
Yeah, I would say by and large, the AA minus rating is probably the highest we've seen on the solid waste side. Yeah. So certainly a high A, low AA is achievable, but on the high end.
Yeah, I agree with that. The idea of getting a AAA is unrealistic, just to be honest, for a variety of reasons. Mostly it's a solid waste, revenue bond. It's not a water revenue bond or an electrical revenue bond or a sewer revenue bond where you have, there are still more risks on solid waste in terms of the capturing the waste flows. The waste flow, is it going to go to a neighboring county or not? Do you have flow control? Is the economy going to slow down and you don't have construction waste, and how much of that? What about self-haul? So anyway, there's just a lot. Whereas you have a water revenue bond, everybody needs water. They got to flush their toilets and they got to drink, and so it introduces some additional risks that cause the rating to come down. And then but that's the case for any energy. That's not Merced. That's just any solid waste bond.
And so we're looking at it as a solid waste revenue bond. When I'm looking at this as a landfill to gas energy, could you package it? And does the industry offer bonds specifically to this? I mean, if you listen to the folks that we listened to in previous meetings, and they talk about like actually the gas gets richer over time, and the gas that we're making now is from stuff that was put in the landfill 30, 40 years ago. So yeah. We got 20 years of guaranteed. I would think it would be more attractive. Like the gas is still going to be there.
I mean, it's a good question. Grant, can you go back a slide? So thank you. So if what you're asking, I have two thoughts. One is we certainly might be able to label this what we call a green bond. Okay, because there's a green element.
And the Democrats love that. We ought to be able to sell that pretty easy.
Right, a green bond. There's lots of ways to qualify as a green bond. The question is, does it actually get us something in the market? Are investors willing to pay you, accept a lower interest rate because you're a do-good project versus building a jail or any other project? And the answer is not really, unfortunately. Now, there are some lenders that are tailored to this and will look for it. And so we will certainly target that. But if what you're asking also was, why don't we just structure this bond secured solely as a project finance? Forget the enterprise, okay? It stands on its own 2 feet. The investors take the risk that the O&M may go up or down, or that the revenues may go up and down. That, unfortunately, with this coverage, if you look in column I, is not realistic. Okay, if you're the lender, there's too much risk to you as the lender. Certainly in these years when you're not even positive, there wouldn't be enough revenue to pay the debt. That's a no-go. And then in the other years, we like to see coverage, above 1.2 and usually in the 1.5 range at a minimum. To deal with volatility and shocks to the system. And, look, I worked on a deal for you guys back in your 05. In 05, I think it was a solid waste revenue bond just for the enterprise, a cell or a liner or something. And, that was right before the economy tanked with the subprime crisis. And all the self-haul literally evaporated, all that construction waste. And that was about 50% of your enterprise at the time. Now you're much more diverse now. You got a much more, I think, prudent system. But that, so that's why they want coverage. That's why they want that cushion, because there's a lot of revenue volatility. So I don't think this project lends itself well to being packaged as a debt instrument just on its own. I think you'd end up with a much you probably wouldn't get a rating. It would be unrated, and you'd get a much higher interest rate, which would just make the economics worse.
And that makes sense. But I guess I'm looking in my own world, or the way that I'm looking at it, not just mentally for me. I'm saying the RWA still backs it, but we don't call it a solid waste bond. We look at it as another piece. And is that something available in the marketplace that would allow us to achieve a lower interest rate? I guess just food for thought on, if we're doing something.
Explore that. Yeah, and with the underwriter, once we get the underwriter on board, they'll have a lot of resources on that. And then, and I want to address one other point. I agree with your point about, look, if you end up somewhere in the middle on O&M, you add that to the 800,000, you got the flare costs. I mean, that's not, that's not nothing in terms of this. And I've been on calls, can't remember if it was the Tetra Tech folks who said, look, if the authority doesn't do this, the private sector would. Which tells you there's some juice in this, in their view, but that's not my area of expertise, so I can't speak to that. What the private sector would or wouldn't do, with this opportunity.
Oh, perfect. All right, thank you for answering the questions. That's all I have, Madam Chair.
Yeah, good questions.
Okay, Director Faria, did you get your question answered because your hand is down?
Yes, my question was answered in the last conversation.
Okay, and so we have a question for Director Kale. Keep saying doctor.
Dr. Kale, is that what you said? Sorry, that's all right. So I want to get this straight. So we're looking at a $24 million project. How much? And this is for the UC. How much is the UC doing to get this project, or what are they doing to supplement this project for them? Or are they doing nothing and we're going to give them a cut rate cost for the cost of this natural gas?
Mm-hmm. Director Kale, this is Eric. Stacy, if you don't mind, maybe I'll jump on
I was actually going to say, hey, Eric, do you want to take that one?
Excellent. I think Stacy and I have been talking about this so much. We're both thinking alike. That's a good idea. Director Kale, great question. And I would say to you that in the very beginning, staff, and let me just also say that UC Merced is not a part of today's workshop. They will be on the March 18th call. And so we can direct questions directly to UC Merced at that time. So just know that that's an opportunity that you'll have. But in answering that, it's a very good question. When the prior staff at the agency went to go and was given direction from the board in 2016 to begin these negotiations, our understanding is that the UC campus had already embarked on a aggressive $100 million solar farm project that was helping all of the UC campuses, not just UC Merced. And so their system was already in place. And so we had a shared beneficial use, if you will. One of the things that the staff prior had looked at, and they had seen what could we do with our gas? Who was the biggest user of this gas? And then could give us the guarantee of revenues of the use of that gas. And not only could the UC system utilize our gas, but they could then use our heat. They run heat to boilers to produce power for their campus. And so we had a secondary source of power that could then be used by the UC campus. And so another component to that was that the UC campus was going to then allow us to put those microturbines on their campus. The authority does not have a lot of room. All of our room that we have right now is used for in-place trash or future in-place trash. So this assisted with airspace of keeping airspace at the authority. Those turbines will go on the UC campus, and that was a part of that negotiation process to allow that to occur. So the UC campus did allow that to occur for our benefit. And then to be in agreement with a term of 20 years. If we were going to go out on a large bond like this, to make sure that we were fiscally responsive, we needed a buyer of as much of this power that we could produce, both electricity and heat from our gas, such that we could seek revenues on all streams. UC Merced was willing to sign that 20-year agreement. Now going forward, UC Merced, as you know, they have many, many acres of land around that campus. So that campus has the ability to expand, and this system as well has the ability to expand. And so the agreement would be set up to allow more power to go their way. And so with that, I brought up the solar farm. I will just tell you that the initial, we're aware that the initial rates that were established with UC Merced was to allow us to be competitive with rates that they were already paying because of the solar farm that they had with the UC system. So Director Kale, I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, it kind of does. In other words, you're not going to help support this in any way other than giving us a 20-year agreement that doesn't apply. When they're being directed from a UC system, is that you got to do something. So they're really making out like not doing that. I mean, when we get a project for any community that involves building something, the majority of the time, the person who's going to benefit from that gives us either produces us better infrastructure or excuse me, or other instances like that. And the UC is not having to do that at all. I find this really difficult to swallow, because I have difficulty swallowing anyway. But I really do find it kind of difficult. And then to turn around in 20 years and say, okay, well, we're going to take out these turbines if you don't want them anymore, or anything else. So I guess my last question is, have we looked at other potential sources that we could use this natural gas for, besides just venting it out and burning it?
Yes, yes, thank you for that, Director Kale. Yes, we initially were looking at direct use, power at the landfill, or evaporation of leachate. We were looking at all forms on our site. We looked at natural gas, high BTUs, and pipeline to various users. The challenges there is we are surrounded by farmers, and so trying to produce as much as we wanted to kick out, there wasn't a guaranteed end user that would use all of our gas. Electricity, engines and turbines that generate electricity, and then power lines to users. That's another cost. That's another system of putting that in. And so those infrastructure costs were looked at in 2016 through 2018 and determined to be too cost prohibitive and not enough benefit to warrant to continue. They looked at fuel for CNG vehicles, for this. And so the ultimate package came in the form of a cogeneration, where you had combined heat and power from this gas that gave you gas combusted to make electricity, and then also heat recovered for for boiler and heating. And so there is the part that they did look at other options, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Now, to answer the question on, there's also an environmental component. This is right now, we currently actively burn, the gas into the environment. And so in this manner, what we will be doing is we will be assisting the environment, taking that gas, piping it out and putting it into turbines to produce reusable forms of energy. And so this is not only helping the environment, but this also goes together with the climate action goals that you're going to hear about in the UC Merced workshop, where they're consistently trying to be forward focused on their goals to be energy friendly and sufficient. The other part of this, and I don't want it to be lost in this, and I'm not advocating one way or the other, but this project is a regional huge project, and it will bring jobs to this region. And so MCAG has informed us that they are committed to working, here in this area here with that. So, we're hopeful that we can also bring jobs to this community with this project. So there is some shared benefits. And at the end of the 20 years, when right now I think interest rates are such that the bond is doable, if the interest rates were higher, I would agree with some of these numbers. Maybe we are really considering an alternate, but this is really in a position where I think there's a win-win, especially given my current O&M contract not being, extremely significant financially, and then just applying those same services over to this next part of our contract. At the end of 20 years, you then begin to reap the benefits of a reward of getting a new contract, a new gas for a series of years. And I don't have, UC Merced staff has been fully committed to this project. I don't have anything that tells me from those conversations that UC Merced is looking to pull out at the end of that 20 years. Matter of fact, what I'm hearing is that they are wholly dependent upon this, and they wanted this before the end of last year. So I do feel we have a committed partner in UC Merced.
Well, I can understand how they're committed. They don't have any risk. They're not looking at they're not going to have to answer questions from our constituents who say, why do we have this bond out here to raise money when we're not benefiting from it? And the UC is going to do nothing but reap the benefits of that, because they're going to collect and utilize every single tax benefit for the fact that they look what we've done to make the environment better, and they're going to utilize that all together. And they don't, of course they're not going to complain about it. They don't want to have to pull out. There's no risk involved in it.
Sure. Director Kale, I don't have really anything that disagrees with what you said. I mean, we don't have a tangible, well, let me back up. The tangible parts of the microturbines being placed on the UC campus is their part of saying that we do have an end, because we are taking land out of their development ability and putting it, and they've left it ready for us since we began discussing this project. So if you go to the campus now, which we had hoped that we would bring you all to during the workshop, you will see that this vacant piece of land is waiting for these improvements, right? The other part is that their commitment is that they are going to be the buyer of the 19 million kilowatts of electricity that we produce, right? So that's good news, and they can potentially buy the heat that's produced as well. So their part would be, they are our partner with their buying, their commitment to the contract terms, and then also with offering up their land for the facilities to be built on there. I will add that the purchase power agreement is not yet approved by this board, and it will come back to this board for approval. And that agreement will then spell out and delineate, I know that David had spoken to, if there was a scenario where UC Merced backs out, highly unlikely, but should it occur, the PPA, the purchase power agreement, will then secure if they back out at 20% of the project being in place, or 40 or 60. It will have all of those languages in them for you to see that it safeguards and secures our interests.
And this is Stacy. I just want to add to that, and sorry, the glare's coming in. I think this really gets to the fundamental question of why the board would want to potentially pursue this project. I think looking at it as this is, there's an environmental benefit that we could pursue in this project. And if we can make a little money in the process of doing it, or know that we have mitigated the risk, we're achieving that environmental benefit, and we're able to mitigate the biggest risk by having a partner on the other side committed to purchasing the product for 20 years. So I think it really gets to that fundamental question of why the board would want to pursue this. And if that environmental benefit plus, doing something different, having a greater environmental benefit, and potentially making, $1 to $10 million based on what we saw today, at the end of it, you know, the biggest risk mitigation factor is in having a secured buyer for the product we would be producing. So with that, I'll go back on.
Okay, Director Silvera and then Director Perea.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, Eric, I think that what would benefit this group is really to understand, like, I guess for me, I thought along the lines of Director Kale early on of like, okay, if they have no risk and they're locking in their rate, is who here on this call can tell me that rate that we're getting is, because I don't know, like, is that a good rate? You know, and then listen, there's always risk and reward and the benefit of locking something in. You know, when you look at PG&E's rates, I'm in the area where PG&E represents it, and I have an ag well, and you know, you have the off-peak times where they'll sell you the electricity for like, you know, 6 cents a kilowatt, but then if you go 1 hour into the high peak time, what it cost you for 1 hour, you ran it the other, you know, it cost you more to run it in that 1 hour than it did to run it for the 6 hours preceding that. So I think if we could better understand the benefit of the rate that we're getting, that's, I guess, is probably what I think some of us want to see is, you know, I get it. We see what the pro forma says. We see what the numbers are. Maybe we end up somewhere in the middle there. But the other part that maybe sticks in some people's craw is the fact that like that rate that was negotiated really before we knew any of what the numbers were going to be, the cost, anything like that. Like, is that a good rate? I don't know. This is not really my wheelhouse. And then the other question that I have for you is when you convert gas to energy through combustion, there's a byproduct of heat being created. If you didn't have the secondary piece for the boilers, right, for them to be able to heat through the boiler system, would that still be an economical project? Could you just convert landfill gas to energy without having that secondary piece in there? And if so, if you know, what would you do with that if you didn't have it to put into that other system?
Right. I'm going to, you know, first I'm going to talk about the rate, and then I'll answer the heat, and really maybe I can lean on Paul Stout a little bit with that answer as well. But for the rate, my understanding is that the staff in earnest went and negotiated a you know, this at the direction of the board with UC Merced, and UC Merced had already had an agreement and has an agreement, all of the UC campuses, by way of this solar farm that they had. So in order for us to be competitive, our rates had to be near or around theirs. And so I will tell you that our current rate is above what their current rate is now. So the 14 cents is more than what they pay now. And then we have this tiered 11 cents that if they go over, you know, the 19 million in electricity, and or they get into the heat that's produced, these are other areas of revenue that we can grab at another rate. So going on now to the heat, and so competitive, that's why the rates were what they were. It was for us to be able to be competitive and then agree upon there that, you know, we're going to reduce, the authority's going to reduce its gas migration issues, the greenhouse gas emissions will be reduced, we'll be a better neighbor. We will be generating renewable energy, both the campus, UC wants that, we want that. And then there are operational costs that are covered, you know, by the agreement. So, and those will be spelled out in the MOU and the PPA. So now on to the conversion of the gas to energy. The agreements that I've seen, the heat aspect of this is an added bonus. It is something that we know right now the campus, the UC campus, is utilizing now for power, and our heat would make it even more efficient, and is something that would be an extra revenue that is not in your performance. It's not something that's calculated now because it's not a guarantee. And Paul, if you could, maybe you can add a little bit more to what I've already said on that heat energy, if you would, to answer the director's question.
Yeah, so I was involved on the periphery of some of the early conversations, and yes, the core price of the electricity is tied to what they're also getting other forms of electricity for, i.e. solar and others. So that kind of started with the 11 cents a kilowatt hour. We got a higher rate, 14 cents a kilowatt hour for 3 of the 4 microturbines to be located on their property if we agreed to also give them heat off those turbines. They cannot get heat from solar panels. They have a bunch of old boilers that power a hot water loop around the campus. And the heat off our microturbines is one of the few ways they can supplant that those natural gas fired boilers. So they were willing to up the price for the microturbines that were also providing them heat as long as we made the heat available, even though the reality is they only use the heat, really predominantly 4 or 5 months out of the year. So that went to kind of where the rates came from. If we don't, like the one turbine that we have over there that we won't have a heat recovery unit on, yeah, it'll operate, the microturbines will operate functionally almost indifferent whether or not they got a heat recovery unit on it or not. So that's kind of where that's at. And I will tell you, I mean, from my perspective, and
Paul, thank you, because I didn't.
I think we lost him. Director Perea, what was your question?
Well, so not really a question. I just want to share a little bit after listening to John, because you're like Director Silvera, I was too, skeptical of this project early on. But as I, and I've asked, I think, some questions that kind of almost seemed to be agitating, but I did that because I wanted to get the information and make sure that what I was getting was what I thought I was getting. And so, and I asked the question about the 41,000 a year, anyways, to get to a spot where worst case scenario, this project breaks even, it has upside to it. And not only is the upside the savings of the $2.5 million to improve the flare project, the other upside is that in the future, right, the cost of getting rid of NOx is going to go up. And exactly. So, the air district is being forced by EPA and CARB to take a harder and harder look at stationary sources of emissions. And so the savings, the $2.5 million up front is really a minimum, right? The savings over the next 20 years will be far greater than that. And as far as the cost, I think the electricity is going to the UC at about 14 cents a kilowatt hour. If we were to do this project and tie into PG&E and sell them the power, we're probably looking at somewhere between 3.5 and 4 cents a kilowatt hour. So, John, that's part of the UC skin in the game. And I think the others have kind of shared that as well. So as this is developed, I now think it's a great project. And I think down the road, we're going to find that this is probably the right decision. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Madam Chair, just if I could interject, I know that KNN had a couple of more slides that were involving some stress scenarios, but also about, I think it was debt capacity. I can't remember. I just wanted to point that out if the board, this is great discussion that we can continue, but I just wanted to point that out in the event there was an interest to continue with the rest of the presentation.
Okay, so Director Silvera, do you have one more question?
Just more of a comment. I want to thank my colleague, Director Pereira, for his comments, because I really, that's one of the things that we're not talking about is, and I think Director Pereira is probably just as familiar with anybody sitting on the air board, that we're looking at it in today's lens with all the stresses that we have and environmental rules that doesn't seem like they're getting any lighter. They only seem like they're going to be getting stiffer. And we're coming up with a solution now that if we're forced to do it 5 years from now, number one, who knows what the interest rates will be? And number two, what will it cost us then when the price of poker went up? When now we're not just doing it out of the goodness of our heart, but we're doing it because of a whole host of other reasons. So I think those were all great comments, and I appreciate you making those. And I think that thank you for kind of explaining that piece on Paul on the, because I thought I was cutting out the piece on how did we get to those rates? Because that was probably my hardest hill to get over, is how do we set rates based upon something that we don't even know what the cost is yet, but we really, I think I understand the approach a lot better now. So thank you for that.
Okay, well then let's move on, and you go ahead and finish the slide presentation.
Okay, great, thank you. And what a great conversation. I'm so glad that this has spurred some real thoughtful discourse. And you've raised a lot of issues I hadn't been thinking of either from the regulatory and environmental perspective. I'm going to turn it over to Melissa Schick, my colleague. She's going to go quickly over the second section. We're going to try and live within our 2 hours, so we have another 15 minutes, and she's going to hit the highlights.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone, and pleasure to be with you this afternoon. The second section, as David kind of prefaced at the start, is just we looked at the project in isolation, which is first and foremost, but then also just the project in the context of the enterprise, as the enterprise would be the security for borrowing. So next slide. This is just Director Silvera, what are solid waste revenue bonds? And we'll certainly work with you on how we name them, but this is how the bond and credit market views a debt offering from a solid waste enterprise. And really what they're looking to is the net revenues of a solid waste system. And that's simply your gross revenues that are primarily your tip fees, less your O&M, to get to a net revenue figure. And that then is what is being pledged to your bondholders or your lenders. And then there's certain security features within the context of the borrowing that makes bondholders feel comfortable with lending to a particular enterprise. And really this key security feature is coverage. What are your net revenues relative to your debt obligation? In the middle of the page, we just kind of have a sample of, to get to a 1.2 times coverage using simple numbers. And in fact, that's what your 2015 bonds, that's your legal requirement. Next slide. So just a snapshot, the authority has borrowed in the past. You have outstanding 2015 bonds, approximately 13.7 million of par is outstanding, and those will mature in 2027. And then if you were to issue debt on behalf of the project, the expectation is that they would be issued as what we call as parity to your outstanding bonds, meaning that the bondholders to the new debt would have the same rights and security as the bondholders to your existing debt. Next slide. So what is the net revenue pledge of your enterprise? Well, it consists primarily of your primary revenues marked by your tip fees and charges for services, and then just other operating revenues, out-of-county revenues, and interest income. And then primary expenditures of the enterprise, primarily O&M, to get to a net revenue figure, revenues minus expenditures. And then you have your debt payments, and that's the key metric that we're looking for in terms of coverage relative to your outstanding obligations. After paying debt service is when you have available surplus revenues to pay other needs of the system, and really primarily capital. As we look at systems like this, how much additional free-flowing available resources do you have to maintain your system, or build reserves, in which you'll see the enterprise has tremendously strong liquidity and reserves as we look at it today. Next slide. So this is just a snapshot of the enterprise financial position from a historical perspective. It's relatively simplistic in form, but what it aims to do is to show you a history of the total revenues of the enterprise over the last 5 years, as well as total expenditures. You'll see that, you know, there's been, even without raising tip fees, there's been quite a strong growth in the revenues of the enterprise. And total revenues consist of, again, both your tip fee revenues, operating revenues, and other non-operating revenues of the enterprise. So as we look at your net revenues on a historical basis and your 2015 outstanding debt service, it's a tremendously strong credit story. And this is the story that we would present to bondholders in the credit market, where you have debt service coverage in excess of 4 times of your debt obligation. And then you'll see at the bottom just a very strong cash position of just under 40 million as of fiscal 20. So a lot of you know, strength with regards to a net revenue pledge, and then strength with regard to liquidity in the enterprise. Next slide. So what we did is we worked closely with Eric, Nav on the finance side to say, model the implications of the project, layering in project costs and project debt and project revenues, and what that does to the enterprise, and primarily with regard to tip fees. And is the enterprise burdened by layering in the project onto its balance sheet? So these were the assumptions we made, and we said, let's keep revenues flat. Let's not raise tip fees and see if the enterprise can support the existing obligation. And we increased your O&M expenses. So this is increases, this is apart from the project, but it's expenses of the revenue, of the enterprise. And then we also built in the below the line figures, and you have a 5-year capital improvement program estimated just over 25 million. And so made certain that there would still be resources to fund capital needs of the enterprise away from the project. And then we took into account your debt obligations existing and your legal obligations around that, which is a rate covenant or a debt service target of 1.2 times. Next slide. So then this is a pro forma snapshot of the enterprise with the project. So the top section projects revenues of the enterprise without the just of the enterprise. So, and in this instance, we kept tip fees flat, and we were pretty conservative with regard to tonnage. So you'll see beginning in fiscal 21, total net revenues of the enterprise actually are projected to decline over the next 5 years. And that's merely because we're increasing expenses at a greater rate than we're increasing revenues. And then the middle section just lifts the project revenues and expenses and RWA costs to arrive at the annual net project revenues that we reviewed with you earlier in the presentation. So you'll see the green line in the middle of the page is just merely the sum of projected RWA net revenues and projected project net revenues. And then we said, what's a resulting debt service coverage ratio, assuming both your outstanding obligations, the 2015 bonds, as well as with the project debt. And then taken together, we project, that coverage is still quite strong, and it's in and around 2.5 times at the point when there's, a full debt payment required on both the 2015 bonds and the 2021 bonds. So remember, your rate covenant and what you're legally bound to by your bond documents is that you maintain a minimum coverage of 1.2 times before you are required to increase tip fees. In this instance, the pro forma is resulting in coverage in and around 2.5 times. So with that, next slide, Grant, why don't you move forward to the debt capacity slide. Next slide. So this is just to say, because you're layering on new debt and it's project debt, and you still have coverage at 2.5 times on a pro forma basis, is to try and capture that the enterprise still maintains an ability to issue debt beyond that of the project and in the future for potential other projects of the enterprise. And so assuming net revenues, we took two snapshots, one net revenues as of fiscal 20, and then net revenues projected for fiscal 21 that are, $1 million lower, but taken together, that green final line is effectively future debt capacity of the enterprise after the financing the project with additional debt. And that's anywhere from 35 million to 45 million of additional debt that could be issued for enterprise projects. So that's kind of maybe just a gut check to say what is, we talked about the project in isolation, but then just to making sure that even with the project, that the enterprise is certainly strong and healthy now, and ensuring that would be the case by layering the project onto the enterprise. I think with that, we're happy to take questions or conclude.
And Melissa, maybe just mention what the two stress scenarios are that we did run, so that they know they're there.
Yeah, and I think Stacy, if you or Eric want to, you can send the presentation out to the board. But the following section just has two stress scenarios that we ran. One was just to say, okay, out of county is bringing a good amount of revenue currently. And what if we stress that out of county revenue so that it declines by 50%. Even in that case, you would not be in a position where tip fees would need to be raised, and you'd still meet your debt covenant of the 1.25 times. So that would be, Grant, I think if you scroll to 23, slide 23, you'll see that the top line total operating revenues have been stressed, taking out 50% of out of county revenues. And then the bottom yellow debt service coverage line still says you maintain your minimum coverage ratio of 1.2 times. And then we were told to throw in a very draconian situation where all county revenues it's assumed that you know, no more out of county revenues are received. And in that instance, you know, the enterprise would not be able to maintain, you know, coverage on outstanding debt. And that would be an instance where tip fees would need to be increased to meet the debt obligations.
Okay. Are there any questions?
Madam Chair, while we're waiting for questions, Melissa did mention we can send out the slide deck, and I did receive a request to get the slide decks distributed from all the workshops. So we'll get those collected and get them out to the board by tomorrow.
Thank you.
Are you sure that Scotty doesn't have any questions?
I'm waiting.
Here's my hand.
Director Silvera, do you have a question or a comment?
No, mine is more of a comment. It just, actually, I want to thank staff for putting together and like kind of wrapping this all up and finally getting us to a point where, at least for me, I understand it enough to know that I think that it's a project that we should probably move forward with. I'm looking forward to the next steps at the next meeting. I know that Eric had mentioned that the UC is going to be at the next meeting. I don't know how much more that they could really add to the conversation, other than they're going to tell us how this helps them with all of their green energy stuff. You know, I think it probably might cause more confusion than questions answered. But if they want to be there and they want to get the ask of how come you can't give us 16 cents instead of 15 cents, I mean, hey, bring it on. I'll ask. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, staff.
Okay. Are there any other questions or comments? Because if not, I'm moving on to number 4, which is public comment. Okay. Thank you so much for your presentation. With public comment, item number 4 is another period of public comment. Mary Michael, do we have anybody who would like to address the board from the public?
I don't see any hands raised, but just as a reminder to folks, if you're on the phone, you can press *9 to raise your hand. If you're participating by Zoom, you can find the raise your hand button, and it could be in different locations if you're on a laptop or tablet, so we'll just give them a couple more seconds.
Okay, thank you.
I don't see any hands being raised.
I don't either. So with that, thank you so much for your presentation today. We really appreciate it. Thank you for being here. And I will adjourn the meeting at 4:55. So we made it almost 5 minutes before 5 o'clock. We will see you at
Madam Chair.
Thank you. We'll see you at the regular meeting, which is March 18th at 3 o'clock right here. Be there, be square.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
Thank you. Bye.